Hello? Hello? This is a sound check.
We just wanted to welcome everybody. We waited on this treat. We members knew about it, and you friends that have come.
Closer to the mic, Betty.
Lower.
Closer.
Welcome. I am only here to tell you how we look forward to this as members, and then you're coming as guests and friends of Janet's and the Sarjeants. It's just special. So it's a good night we all have to look forward to, and I'm not going to do a thing but introduce Gary to come as Janet's friend. He will introduce her. But I want to personally thank her, as long as I have the mic here. I want to thank her for listening. We go back a long way, and I remember when the Sarjeants moved here, and I've watched them grow and serve. But Janet listened all this time, taking notes when she was around these wise men, and then is talented enough to share them with us in this book. So I want to thank her.
Yes, thank you. I'm Gary Hudson, a former chaplain at Southminster Retirement Community, and tonight I have the privilege and the honor of saying some opening words about Janet and her book. Janet and I first met about 10 years ago at Southminster Retirement Community, where her mother, Mrs. Eloise Bass, is a resident. Janet and her longtime dear friend Goldie Stribling, who is here tonight, co-lead a weekly Buechner reading group at Southminster. This group has been meeting 9+ years, which is longer than any other life enrichment group in the 34-year history of Southminster. Across these 9+ years, Janet and Goldie have suggested several times that maybe it was time to bring the group to an end, only each time to cause an almost uprising among the group members. The group will not let Janet and Goldie to quit. Janet's book, Deep Calls Unto Deep, Reflections on the Intersecting Lives and Writings of Fred Buechner, Tony Abbott, and Louis Patrick, is a scholarship of the head and the heart. Pertaining to the head, Janet knows the writings of these three, and regarding the heart, she draws lovingly from her longtime friendships with each of them. Only Janet Sarjeant could have written this book. Like Fred Buechner, Tony Abbott, and Louis Patrick, Janet loves words. She knows their power and that sometimes they can even save us. I asked Janet, "When did your love of words begin?" And Janet responded, "I seem to have always had a love of words and liturgy. My mother said I didn't want to go to the church nursery. I wanted to be in the sanctuary. And so I think it is most appropriate that this evening, as we have gathered here in a sanctuary, to hear these words. Janet's book is a work for God and for God's kingdom here on earth." Janet, thank you.
Thank you, Gary. You're not supposed to make the person who's speaking next tear up. It is nice to be in here with you. It's so gratifying. Thank you for coming out, from neighbors to childhood friends to sons and husbands and friends and church members whom I love. So I am glad to be with you in a sanctuary to honor these three men. So I have some prepared words, and then if you have any questions at the end, we'll have a microphone and you can ask me, and I will try my best to answer them. I also want to point out that Gary Hudson is also a Buechner scholar, and it is through Gary that I was asked through him to be a part of the Buechner Institute that came to Myers Park Baptist, and we have 4 members here, back in 2014. And I got to present a lecture there, and it was through Gary. And the Buechner Institute paid me pretty well. Southminster wants to pay me for teaching the Buechner reading group, and I get a glass of wine every Wednesday. So let me begin. Vincent Van Gogh, and I'm using this as a topical reference, don't you think, since he's in the immersive, Van Gogh's immersive show. But as I prepared for the show, I read his book, and I found that he had written to his brother Theo, and he said this: "It is good for me to work hard, but that does not keep me from having a terrible need of," shall I say the word? Yes, religion. "Then I go out and paint the stars." I think we have to carefully define the word religion because it carries so much connotative meaning these days. It's not a word I use very often to say I'm religious, or this is my religion. It just has a lot of history and a lot of connotative meaning. But I'm going to choose a definition from Fred Buechner because, well, I like it. I like his definition. So this is what Fred Buechner wrote about the word that I'm afraid to use. Fred wrote this in his book, A Room Called Remember. Quote, "Religion as a word points to that area of human experience where, in one way or another, someone comes upon mystery as a summons to pilgrimage, where he senses meanings no less overwhelming because they can only be hinted at in myth or rituals, but he is glimpsing a destination that he can maybe never know until he reaches it." He goes on and says this is Fred: "We are all of us more mystics than we believe or choose to believe. Life is complicated enough as it is, but we have seen more than we let on, even to ourselves. Through some moment of beauty or pain, some sudden turning of our lives, we catch glimmers, at least of what the saints are blinded by. Only sometimes we tend to go on as though nothing has happened. But if we go on as if something has happened, even though we're not quite sure what it is, or what we're supposed to do with it, or where we're supposed to go with it, that is to enter the dimension of the word that religion is for. Some, of course, go to the typewriter," he says. "First the lump in the throat, and then the clatter of keys, the tingling of the right-hand margin." You can see when he wrote this. "And then some of us do things like Pascal, who sewed these words wrote them on a piece of paper. They're famous, you know them. Pascal, that night, scratched on a piece of paper the words, 'Fire,' certitude, certitude, feeling, joy, peace, stammering the words out like a child because he had to. And a servant found that piece of scratch paper sewed into his jacket after his death. This is the end of Fred's definition of religion, and it is much like Van Gogh's moment of seeing mystery and going out and painting the stars. That setting it down in black and white is what the three authors in this book did. First, they come upon mystery, then the lump in the throat, and then the writing. All my adult life, the writings of these three men, Lou Patrick, Tony Abbott, and Fred Buechner, brought a lump to my throat. I, like so many others, have been storing their words in my heart so that when I needed them most, they were there. And then last year, a realization caught me by surprise during the pandemic. Now, unlike my friend Mary Kratt and maybe some of you, I only dabble in history, but I am my family's historian and I am Trinity Presbyterian Church's historian. And you know what that means. I save things. I'm afraid to throw away a piece of paper because it might have the key to the history. So you can pity Dale and really pity Daniel because I save everything. So last year, Louise Sanford, who's sitting there, and I were charged to go through old files of Dr. Patrick's sermons and files of correspondence. Dr. Patrick was Trinity's senior minister. And as we sat there, right then, I probably told you about it, Louise, it dawned on me that Trinity was the meeting place for these three towering figures in their respective fields, Lou Patrick, Tony Abbott, and Fred Buechner. And the wonder of it all, the God's hand in it all, was that their interconnected lives and interconnected subjects and their way with words. I went home and began writing this history, or as I think of it, I began connecting the dots. I realized I had access to treasures that the world at large had never seen. And like letters from Fred Buechner to Lou Patrick, to Goldie Stribling, to me. I had letters from Lou to Tony Abbott. I had letters from Fred Buechner to Trinity Presbyterian Church. Recorded dialogues between Lou and me, and sermons typed out on onion-skin paper by Lou's secretary, Florence Bramhall. These masters of the written word, I thought, need to be shared with the world, for the world needs them. I thought, because I had all these conversations and experiences with these three writers hanging around in my head, and I wanted to get them on paper. Although there was no nice ting-a-ling from the right-hand margin or the sound of a carriage return from a typewriter, but I had the tap, tap, tap of my fingers on the computer keys. I don't remember that the writing was hard, actually. I easily came up with connecting the theme of deep calls unto deep from Psalm 42. I knew Psalm 42 was Lou Patrick's favorite psalm, and Bonson's, too. I loved Lou Patrick. From the pulpit, from the classroom, from our times together, he taught me what he knew about God and humanity together. Yes, he had feet of clay like us all, but now and then one meets a man or a woman unlike others, and I tried to convey that in the book. The thing about Lou is that I could not predict or second guess what he was about to say. Now, I could hear the scripture, I might have studied the scripture perhaps, but somehow his thinking was so fresh and almost new that I could not know where he was going with his thinking. Do you know someone like that? I would sit in his presence, most often in this sanctuary, and would think to myself, I know where he's going with this. I know some of the scripture. And then the lump in the throat from the sheer surprise of where he took me. Brilliant. Lou Patrick is that man for me. And interestingly, Fred Buechner says about the same kind of thing about sitting in Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church and listening to the great preacher George Buttrick, and it changed his life. So, Lou Patrick introduced me and so many others to writers like Tony Abbott and Fred Buechner, who bring a lump to the throat. The parallels among these three are evident, but they kept coming as I kept looking. They wrote out of tragic events. They have the Princeton University connection. They all three thought The Wizard of Oz was transformingly important. They used common motifs like the apple tree, and so I wrote. And in my brainstorming, and then my outline, and then my rough draft, I'm an English teacher, I knew there would be a chapter for each writer, and along with biography, a weaving in of the ways the three men's lives and writings intersected, I knew I had my form. So I started with Dr. Patrick. That was after Job. Job started the book, but on page 14 is where I will start, and I'll just read something from each of the men's chapters. And this is from a 1976 sermon by Lou Patrick. He starts with these words. I'm back on 13, bottom of 13, moving to 14. Ever since I was a child, I have been strangely haunted by these words out of Psalm 42, the 7th verse. Deep calls unto deep at the thunder of thy cataracts, O God. Lou goes on in the sermon to say that he knows that the psalmist who wrote the poem was in exile in the rugged peaks of Mount Hermon and Mount Mizar, the peaks where the River Jordan has its rise. The poet who wrote that psalm is listening to the river surging through those mountain passages with its awful thunder. He is missing his village. He is missing home, says Lou Patrick. This sermon, that's the end of that quote, this sermon uses the idea and the reality Lou has been fashioning his whole life of the price humans pay when leaving the time before time, which is a childhood home, and heading into the world that is measured in time, birth to death. Lou says in this sermon, quote, you leave the village, your home, and go up into the gaps where the mysteries are, where the real questions are. End of quote. He ends this sermon by saying, now this is why we come to worship. We come because the deep in us hears the call of the deep in the unsearchable judgments of God, whose ways are not the village ways. We do not come into the presence of this God by the step-by-step logic of discovering his ways. There's no way to him except to stand in the gaps and hear the thunder of his cataracts. And nowhere is the sound so clear as in the coming of the one called Jesus. God can bring to us this ultimate mystery of one who so lived and died here that in him sound the very deeps of God. Nowhere does Jesus supply explanations to the questions of pain and sin and death. He simply bore them and lived them and triumphed over them. There is no other way to live in the mystery where the deep calls unto deep except to stand lost in wonder and love and praise before the thunder of God's cataracts, not the sound of ours. End of quote. In 1956, Lou had a sermon that was on the Protestant Hour, and he pulled out all the literary stops there were. It's filled with literary allusions and biblical allusions, and it's called Balm in Gilead. And he ended that with Dickens' story in Tale of Two Cities of going to the guillotine for the main character. And there's a young girl riding with him in the cart, and she asked him if he would hold her hand when they go together to the guillotine. And when she gets to the place, she turns to the main character and says, "Thank you. I believe God sent you to me." That sermon would have to be proven in 1 month's time for Lou, because he lost his son by drowning 1 month after that sermon. There it is. He talks about those gaps where you listen differently, the religion, if you will. That was Lou's belief. And there was something else, that darkness that comes into the lives of humans. No one escapes. Lou's was first the divorce of his parents and his leaving the only home he knew, and then secondly, the death of his 6-year-old son by drowning. But as he made his way through grief, he kept writing sermons about Jesus, the one who gave no explanations for pain and suffering and death, but simply bore them and triumphed over them. And if those words from Lou don't bring a lump to our throats, I don't know what can. So along the way of Lou's journey, he was introduced to the writings of a man named Fred Buechner and introduced his books to many of his parishioners. And along the way, Lou planned a Montreat weekend around Fred Buechner's book, The Magnificent Defeat. And he was lucky to get Tony Abbott from Davidson College to help pull the presentation together. Goldie and Betty McClaney were working on the event. Goldie Stribling said to me that she was thrilled to meet Tony. This was back in 1973. And she said, "We were pleased to have him help out because, quote, we didn't know what we were doing." So enter Tony Abbott into the story, chapter 2. Those of you who know Tony know that he answered the call to give lectures often outside of Davidson, and he came to Trinity for several big occasions. The Gilchrist lectures, and he used John Irving's prayer for Owen Meany as his topic. And when he lectured in this sanctuary once, he used Buechner's books. And when he let me ask him all kinds of questions last fall for this book, one answer was that he truly had never heard of Fred Buechner before being asked to help on the Montreat presentation. But he certainly became an expert on Buechner's writings after that, teaching a class at Davidson on Buechner's works, lecturing on Buechner, inviting Buechner to Davidson to speak and to stay with him and his wife Susan, and visiting with the Buechners in Vermont. Now, Lou Patrick's life is not as well known as Tony's. For one thing, Lou rarely spoke of his own life, particularly of the dark times in his life, not from the pulpit, rarely interactions with others. Isn't that true? Trinity people rarely spoke of it. Well, Tony as a child did not talk about dark times either. Tony's parents divorced, his mother remarried, his mother and stepfather quarreled, and his mother shot his stepfather, hitting him in the shoulder. No one died that night, but the family kind of did. It dissolved, and Tony was sent to boarding school at age 9. Once, his mother failed to meet him at New York's Grand Central train station, and Tony, being 10, began to cry. Later in life, Tony wrote a poem about that boy he had been then. He says in the poem that the boy stands, puts his tears away in his back pocket with his used handkerchief. Tony hid his tears And all through the years at school, he excelled, he laughed, he loved, but he did not cry. His tears were in his back pocket with his used handkerchief, after all. And then he suffers another blow. After he came to Davidson College with his wife and 3 children, settling into the community that he called home for the rest of his life, right after that, his 4-year-old daughter, Lynn, died in the night from a form of encephalitis. This is what he says on page 55 of that time. At the bottom of 55, he said, "I had no language to express what had happened." End of quote. Having put away his tears years ago, he had forgotten how to cry, to use tears as a way to get to something like grief, to get to something holy. I'm reminded of Lou Patrick's words to me when once he said, "How blessed are the friends with whom we can laugh, how more blessed and rare are the ones with whom we can weep." But for Tony at that time, he had to learn again to cry, to take out the tears and see where they led him. And out of unbearable grief, he began to write. He said about that time, "I had no language for grief, but I think something was there in the darkness with him, calling him." When he began writing poetry and novels as an adult, he spoke openly after that of his hardships, the divorce of his parents, the alcoholism of his mother, the youth spent at boarding schools, all the while suffering from club feet, and about his daughter's death. In my exchange with him last fall, just before his death in October, I had to really get the courage up to ask him whether all this suffering was too much to write about. Was it too much? And this is what I quoted him on page 65 as saying. I asked him, "Does it hurt, this through-bearing that you've had to go through?" And I answered myself, of course. But when I asked him that question and whether the hurt was too much, this is what he said. "It took time, but I guess what I want to say is that writing about my daughter opened up a whole new part of me that had been closed for a long time, and I felt really good about that, even excited about that. I began to write poems about my mother, my father, my classmates at school. I went back to the business of remembering. Art is a combination of remembering and imagination. You start by remembering and imbue it with imagination. Then the whole thing takes on new life. When I write about these sad things, I am not sad. I am more alive." If that doesn't bring a lump to our throats, I don't know what can. And back on 65, I love just the piece of the poem I included from Before 40. He wrote this last stanza. "So you want a happy ending? I don't know much about that. I cry a lot these days, not for broken shoelaces or spilled beer, but for Bach and the Beatles, and for beauty where I find it. I sleep later, I dream more, and write stuff like this." Tony read chapter 1 of this book about Lou Patrick, and he was so generous with his comments about it. And I sent him the rough draft of his chapter, and he told me that his Davidson office had printed it out for him, and he would talk with me over the weekend. And 3 days later, I heard that he had died, and I will never know whether he read his chapter or not. So chapter 3, that's Fred Buechner. Now, Fred Buechner is the most well-known of the 3 writers. And when I was writing this book, I asked for lots of help from my friends, I'd say. And Landis, is that you back there? Landis, my friend, gave me some good advice when I was doing it. He said he thought I should find an editor. I tried. to find one. They all rejected me, so I had to do it myself, but that's all right. It was good advice. But then he said, and he is a retired lawyer, and he said, if you're writing about other people and using their works, you best get written permission. Otherwise, you might get sued. Landis, I lost some sleep over that. Asked Dale. I was always thinking, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I didn't know what I was doing. Well, I contacted Lou Patrick's daughter Jane, who's a friend of mine, and asked her to read the rough draft of the book, and she wrote back and said it brought tears to her eyes. She said so much to me, and then she said she wished me luck on the publication. And when I contacted Susan Abbott and sent her the draft, she wrote back that she had read it straight through and was so taken with it, and she read it to her son, and she wished me all the best for publication. And when I shared the draft with friend Judy Buechner, she wrote back and said that she had read the book with immense pleasure from beginning to end. And then she said at the end of her letter that she would give her approval, but she would have to turn me over to the executor of the literary assets of Fred Buechner, her husband, and I would have to get their permissions. It's called the FBLA, the Frederick Buechner Literary Assets Lawyers. I have a couple of names I can give to you if you need them. Does this give you an idea of his stature? Fred Buechner, the quotable Mr. Buechner. His way with words has resounded with countless people after 71 years of publishing books. But here in my little book, it is his interwoven relationship with Lou Patrick and Trinity and his acquaintance with Tony Abbott that I dwell upon. Fred Buechner, as a lot of people know, but maybe you don't, had lost his father to suicide when he was 10 years old. He said in his writing that his whole life, everything he's ever written, is as a search for his father. And like Lou Patrick and Tony Abbott, he buried his grief at 10 years old. This is page 79. The loss of my father came to get buried so deep in me that after a time I scarcely ever took it out to look at it at all, let alone to speak of it. If ever anybody asked me how my father died, I would say, heart trouble. That seemed at least a version of the truth. He had had a heart, it had been troubled. And then by grace or by luck or by some cool child's skill for withdrawing from anything too sharp or puzzling to deal with, I stopped remembering so almost completely to remember at all that when a year or so later I came upon my brother crying one day all by himself in his room, I was stopped dead in my tracks. Why was he crying? And when I prodded him into telling me that he was crying about something that he would not name but had said it happened a long time ago, I finally knew what he meant. And I can recapture still my astonishment that for him a wound was still open and that for me, or so I thought, had long since closed. And in addition to the astonishment, there was also a shadow of guilt. Three men, three hard-to-bear darknesses buried deep inside. Three writers' bodies of works that speak to what they found in these buried parts of themselves. And they found that deep calls unto deep. They found each other. In the book, I tell of Lou finding the works of Frederick Buechner on one of his sabbaticals. And then there's the wonderful story that Goldie tells. It's on page 27 of the book, in which she and Betty McClaney, Goldie came into to Lou, and she had found a little bit in the Christian Century that said Fred Buechner was going to be in Bangor, Maine in January. This was at Christmas, and Goldie said, you'd be chicken not to go. And he went, and that's how they finally met. You can read about it on page 27. In Fred Buechner's chapter, there's also another of life's terrible blows when his grown daughter was diagnosed with anorexia and came near to death. And it was right at that time in 1980 that Fred had finally said to his friend Lou Patrick, "I'll come and be the Montreat speaker." Sadly, Fred had to leave early to fly to his daughter's side. She slowly and eventually recovered, but he wrote this letter on page 91 to Trinity. This is an open letter to Trinity Church. As many of you know, the time I was with you was a darkly troubled one for me and my family, a time of great foreboding and grief. In your promise to pray for me and mine, I found hope. And praise be to God, all your prayers together with ours seem to have been heard, because for the moment at least the crisis appears to have passed and things are better than they were. But the road ahead still lies deep in shadow, and I beg you to continue to remember us as we make our way along it. There can be no one of you who does not do hard and lonely battle against dark times that menace us all, in a world in which so often God seems to have forgotten, and which with such dark skill the world manages to hide God from us. So whatever your doubts, whatever your pain, whatever your fear, my prayer is that God of his mercy and grace will strengthen you with the knowledge that he grieves with you in all your grieving, and that no matter how you resist him and seem to lose him, no matter how the world thwarts him, in the end, his saving will be unimaginably and blessedly done. Lou and Fred's friendship deepened immeasurably during this time, and Fred wrote about it. Right after this letter, Lou went to Vermont unannounced and showed up on Fred Buechner's doorstep. Fred writes this letter to Lou Patrick on page 95 after that visit. Fred writes, "And part of the adventure, it just begins to dawn on me, and maybe even the most important part, and the part with vast stores of light and blessing in it, has been the growing realization of how richly and profoundly I have been ministered to." That sounds so churchy and unreal to my hopelessly secular ears, the language of it. But the truth of it is unavoidable. God's jokes are so big and simple that nobody gets them. I am just beginning to get at least one of them, which is that yes, when you are desperate, he comes to you as he always said he would. He sends his servants to you to serve you, to heal and help. He sent me most especially you, Lou. Can I say that without causing you embarrassment? And if that doesn't bring a lump to our throats, I don't know what can. So I connected the dots of the enormous power of the writings and lives of these three friends of mine. It was not that hard to do, for I had all their words whirling around in me my whole adult life. Nothing was that hard, at least not too much, until I had to get the permissions from the Buechner lawyers, and I had to write the works cited page. That almost killed me. And I teach it. It almost killed me. I must add here that deep calling unto deep often seems filled with darkness from these three writers. And I address that in the book. But no, they would say, there's so much light that they bring to us, even though they mention these dark places. They were delightful company, and they laughed so often, shooting shafts of light and hope and peace and joy throughout my life. Oh, the many connections to so many of us. Fred Buechner came to Trinity. We laid out the second time, and we laid out the red carpet, the yellow brick road for him. We had a grand banquet. Lou and Elizabeth hosted the Buechners off and on for years, and vice versa. And when Lou retired, Fred wrote this that's in our scrapbook. Let me see if I have it. When Lou retired, Fred wrote, I went to Montreat at what was a dark time for me and my family, and into that darkness, Lou Patrick brought the light of his faith and his friendship, and in those shaggy Carolina hills, he saved the day. In some sense, saved me. Tony Abbott so mourned Lou's death that he gathered a bunch of us at Kathleen and Bob Schneider's because he just wanted to tell stories about Lou Patrick. And after Lou's death, Fred and Judy still stopped in Charlotte once in a while between Vermont and Florida, never forgetting the connections made in this place. How lucky we are, aren't we? Here in this church, we love to be talking about our good fortune at hearing and reading the words of Lou Patrick, Tony Abbott, and Fred Buechner. And something else, says my Trinity friend, the Reverend Dr. Barron Mullis. He said, I'm so grateful to Barron because he pointed me to Parsons Porch. If you've ever seen the books of where you can publish things, it's hard to get through them, right, Landis? But he sent me to Parsons Porch, who published it. And he wrote the only review that's been, which says, the book is a warm and familial tribute to three towering figures in their respective fields who, in life's good providence, found one another. Indeed, it was here, in this place, on Providence Road, that they found one another. And if that doesn't bring a lump to our throats or speak to the mystery that leads to a pilgrimage, I don't know what can. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here, and if you have any question at all that you'd like to step up to the mic and ask me, I will try to answer it. I tried to put almost everything in the talk, so not much to answer. I think anything that you can find or have a question about is still in the book. I'm trying to think if there's anything that I can think of that hasn't been covered. You have a question, Gary?
Janet, I would like to know, are you aware of any connections between Mary Oliver and these three? Because these three, like Mary Oliver, as I understand it, Mary Oliver said, pay attention, be amazed or be astonished, tell about it. And I know Mary Oliver, if I remember correctly, she lived in Massachusetts. Fred Buechner was in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you know, was there any connection?
Not that I know of,
Okay.
no. But when you read, as we all do, everyone in this room reads so much, and when you read the poets, can I quote Ecclesiastes? There's nothing new under the sun. There's not. And so in fact, Michael, where's Michael? I'm reading, I ordered 3 or 4 books that Fred Buechner said impacted him in his life. Now, I know the most famous ones, the brothers Karamazov, Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, and what was the third one? There's another one. Maybe it was the Bible. No, I don't know what it is. But there were these 4 or 5 that he mentioned that I had never heard of. And so I ordered one. They're so old and out of print that it cost $1.50. And the one I've already finished is called The Towers of Trebizond. I gave it to Michael to read next. And it sounds like Fred. I mean, if he read that in 1950, and he was writing the Bebb books, his novels, it's the same kind of humor. So I think these people find each other. Annie Dillard and Lou Patrick found each other. They talk about the same things. So I do think they find each other. Fred is not going to write about nature as much as, say, Mary Oliver. He's such a bookish type that anytime he talks to me about life on the Vermont farm, and it's Judy I talk to about gardening and horses, and she knows so much about nature. And Fred's looking out the window at the horses and the garden. But they find each other, don't you think? And even if it's late, I just found that poem that it's at the end of Lou Patrick's. He showed it to me that day 15 years ago when I interviewed Dr. Patrick, or 20 years ago. And it's called Everything Rushes, Rushes. And it's in the book. And it is about, by a nun. She is, I've never heard of that poet, never read any of her poetry. And it's my favorite poem at the moment. Everything rushes, rushes to God. Rocks and trees and at the last it says, we're in the race. Come on, it's the most joyful. Everything rushes to God. So I think you find it doesn't matter when it is, you find it. They find each other. Yes, sir. By the way, Landis Wade is, you may have seen him and know all of this, but it's Charlotte Reader's podcast. Yeah, he retired as a lawyer and took up interviewing, writing himself and interviewing everybody that's
Well, first of all,
writing.
Let me apologize for the legalistic advice I gave earlier.
The advice. Can you hear Landis?
Yeah, so, first of all, Janet, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for that. I wanted to make an observation, and then I have a question. I had a chance to interview Tony Abbott about the same time you were interviewing him. I scheduled the interview. We recorded it in September. It was going to come out in October because he was being inducted into the Hall of Fame. And then a day or two before it was to come out, he died. But he read the poem that you talked about, and he read the girl in the yellow raincoat, which was his daughter. And as he was reading it, he was choking up. And I said, Tony, how many times have you read that poem? And he said, countless, but every time I read it, it's the lump in the throat. But he was such a wonderful inspiration. So here's my question. Being the fact that I interview authors all the time, I try to come up with things that might be different. And my question to you is this. This book it sounds to me like it was something that was sort of permeating in the back of your mind, your subconscious for many years. And my question is, because characters in books often are searching for something, authors are too. What were you searching for when you were writing this book, and did you find it? That's all.
Landis, I can't say I was searching for anything. I had already found so much. What I did want was to honor Trinity, because this is where they met. And I've been here 45 years, Dale, right? And I thought that I was amazed. Abraham Heschel, that great Jewish rabbi, said, it went right, I think he was 90 in his last interview, 99, really in his last interview, and they asked a question, and he said, what is the most important word to you? What is it that you find important? And he said, surprise. That's what keeps him going, the surprise of things. You think you know something. And I was so surprised. So yes, my search maybe brought me to being so surprised that here in this, with Janet, who's, I'm nobody. Are you nobody too? Emily Dickinson? Yeah, I'm nobody. There were things I had access to that the world, I thought, would like to know. And it was a search for a way to share them, and I had no idea it would be a book. So no, I never had a dream of writing a book about it. But I was surprised over and over and over again. So if I was searching for really fun things and surprises, I was lucky. Have you got a question, Goldie? She said she can't get there. Let me translate as you go. She said this is God's fault, God planned this, so it's his fault. He gave us a year off, that we had this year off. We won't put that on the tape. You can't hear her, right? So, thank you. She read the first chapter and thought she wasn't sure who was going to buy this book. And as Baron Mullis says, Janet, I don't think you wrote this book to get rich. Dale, don't listen to that.
When's the next book coming out?
When's the next book? Oh my! Thank you so much. Is it? I don't want you to be driving in the dark. Any other questions that you have? But I will. Let me say one more thing about the Buechner, Judy Buechner, who has been my contact for the Buechner family, and such gracious things she said upon reading it. You know, when Landis told me I needed to get permission, think how long this took. I had to send all the rough drafts to them and wait and see if they were going to read them. That was a couple of months, and just waited, and then to hear what they said. But Judy wrote a wonderful note after she finished it and said, I had forgotten a lot of this. And I didn't know Tony Abbott's work as much, but now I want to read more of it from your book. And she said it was so much of Fred's life, and then she said, and mine. I thought that was a wonderful thing, gracious thing to say. And then, in case you're wondering, because I haven't mentioned whether he had read the book, because Judy gave permission, or I got permission finally and signed the contract, and I didn't know whether he had read it. She never mentioned that he had read it. And Goldie, I think you had written a letter, and Judy wrote an email yesterday and said, hi Goldie, I'm sitting outside with the breezes, and I'm reading Janet's book to Fred. So, yeah. Now, in case I could get a big head about all of this, I also want to say that I was sent the contract from the Buechner estate, and I was glad to get it, so glad to get the permission. And the lawyer said, you might want to get your lawyer to look at it. And Landis retired. And so I sent it to Daniel Sarjeant, sitting over there, and Daniel said he would send it to his friend Derek, who's a lawyer, and Derek looked at it and he said, there's nothing out of the ordinary, it's fine, and your mom can sign it with ease. And then Derek said, Daniel, what has your mother written? What kind of book has she written? And Daniel said, I have no idea. I hope you didn't mind me telling that, because it's one of my favorite things. He knows I'm over there writing in that house. He just doesn't know what I'm writing. But thank you all so much. I'm going to be out there if anyone wants me to sign a book, which I think most of you already have your books, and I may have signed them. And if you can chat outside on the way out, that way we won't tempt fate in here, and we'll wear our mask. I cannot tell you how you have touched my heart by coming out to listen to the book talk. Thank you.